Good morning. Because there's so much technology on this desk, you can't move. All right. If you still use pens and papers, it's a problem. Okay. This is a paper. I'm going to present the first dimension of it, and Vibeke is going to present the second dimension, that emerges out of a wider, increasing engagement between realism and rhetoric. This is particularly taking place in the United States, and it's particularly taking place amongst a group of, I think it's fair to say, younger scholars who are seeking to look at the way in which rhetoric can be used to explain certain dimensions of realist foreign policy practice, particularly the relationship between rhetoric and grand strategy, one of the core components of any realist theory of international relations. And these people are most interested in looking at the way in which we can use concepts like rhetorical coercion to understand diplomacy, the ways we can look at things like discursive or rhetorical framings to understand the legitimation and indeed the capacity to enact policies politically. We think this is great. It's really, really an interesting new dimension of work into a broadening of realism. But we want to argue that an engagement with realism and rhetoric goes far beyond simple explanatory theory as a theory of foreign policy. Indeed, what we're trying to argue here is that to engage between realism and rhetoric is to open up foundational questions of the nature of political order in itself. Rhetoric, we want to argue, is not opposed to realism, as is conventionally seen, right? Standard line. Realism believes that rhetoric is either simply fancy window dressing, lies in its crudest form, various forms of ideology, which allow you to put forward more fundamental policies based on rhetoric or what it may be. Or rhetoric was the great misleading feature of believing that words were real and coming up with disasters like those of the 1930s, when naive liberals, the story goes, believed that rhetoric was reality and disaster followed. Our argument is that rhetoric is not actually opposed to realism. Rhetoric is central to realism. Rhetoric is not simply an instrumental part of grand strategy. Rhetoric is, as a matter of fact, something that allows us to see that realism is at its core a theory of what we can call grand politics. And that this is inescapable if one wants to think sensibly, both explanatorily and evaluatively and historically about the realist position on world politics. Okay. To do this, we really set the argument up in two parts. I will present this morning the first part of the argument. For this audience, I suspect some of this is going to be overly familiar. For an American explanatory empirical theory audience, it is rather less familiar, which explains why it's so occupies such a big chunk of the paper. But nonetheless, I still hope it's engaging. Vibeke will present, I think, the more dynamic, perhaps slightly more outrageous parts of the paper, where we attempt to lay out this idea of grand politics and how we think it functioned in a particular period in American foreign policy debate. That is the period largely in the 1950s and the early 1960s, when the question of American national interest and American grand strategy was absolutely at its boiling point in the hottest years of the Cold War. We will then reflect, I think, on some of the implications for this today, because we argue that this is not a historical phenomenon. We argue that the issues raised by the question of the relationship between rhetoric and realism are not only continually important, but they are perhaps more important today in the context particularly of a very, very divided political situation in the United States than they have been for 40 years. Okay. How do we try to make this move? Well, the first thing we try to do is we try to locate the relationship between realism and rhetoric, against the long historical background of the emergence of theories of reasons of state, right? So, the classical conflation within too many understandings of realism, that realism is simply the latest incarnation of 14th, 15th, 16th century traditions of realism, reason of state, we think is both insightful but fundamentally misleading. Modern realism picks up, most definitely, on the transformation in the realism of state literature, which attempted to put interest and the pursuit of interest at the heart of any understanding of politics. But it emerges from a very sophisticated reflection, we argue, on the inadequacies of placing interest at the center of politics. For one thing, we want to point out very strongly, unlike, we think, naive representations of realism in many cases today, the reason of state literature did not distinguish between the manipulative use of rhetoric externally in foreign policy and internally in domestic politics. This was a continual dilemma, as we all know, for reason of state theorists. How was one to tell the truth in politics? How was one to use Machiavelli's classic example to distinguish between the interests of the prince as a person and the interests of a prince as a good prince, i.e. the interests of state? This is an argument that reason of state, in its historical incarnations, never solved fully. There's a wonderfully rich literature about how Catholic thinkers tried to figure this out, how they succeeded, how they more or less failed. But we think it was essential in the articulation of modern realism, in that, in an age where, on the one hand, via liberal revolutions, the concept of interest became ever more embedded in political life, and on the other hand, something we talked about yesterday, the rise of mass politics meant that the question of rhetoric as a form of political mobilization became ever more central. That the inadequacies of interest, and this is an old story, most of us are very familiar with it in this room, the inadequacies of interest as a basis for politics alone became increasingly of concern to anyone of a realist bent. And it became concern for at least two basic reasons. Right? First, because it seemed incapable of generating any kind of understanding of collective interest. That is, the reduction of politics to the pursuit of individual, or even in some strange forms, group interests, seemed to lead to the kind of fragmenting pluralism or entropic pluralism that classical realism thought was absolutely fundamentally debilitating within 19th century liberalism as it emerged into the 20th century. And secondly, that the attempt to get around this fragmenting or entropic dimension led to an increasing use of extreme rhetorics to mobilize precisely that which they sought to overcome. In other words, there is a fundamental explanatory dimension in realism, not at the level of grand strategic visions that have already been formulated, but in fact in destructive rhetorics as an attempt to generate a collective subject capable of having grand strategies at all. The dual concern of realism, certainly as we see modern realism as it emerges, let us say, post-Second World War, but with this whole lineage behind it, is to try to understand the dual dimension of rhetoric, which is both constitutive of a collective subject capable of executing grand strategy, of having national interests, and explanatory, evaluative, and indeed normative, in a sense of being able to confront the consequence of the failure of that project, which is the emergence of extreme rhetorics. This, we think, sorry, I need my papers for this, was absolutely central to the way in which realists understood the dilemmas of American foreign policy. And we think this crossed a very, very large, as Vibeke will talk about, a very large range of thinkers across American intellectual life and policy thinking. Let me give you my favorite quote on how I think this place really crystallizes this. And the quote runs like this. It's a little bit long, but I'll read it anyway. This is a discussion about American foreign policy in the early 1950s and its increasing radicalization. And it goes like this. It's speaking to American foreign policymakers, but particularly to the president. You have deceived once, now you must deceive again. For to tell the truth would be to admit having deceived. If your better judgment leads you near the road of rational policy, your critics will raise the ghost of your own deception, convict you out of your own mouth as an appeaser and traitor, and stop you in your tracks. You have falsified the real issue between the United States and the Soviet Union into a holy crusade, for this seemed a good way of arousing the public. Now you must act as though you mean it. You have presented the Chinese communists, echoes today, as the enemies of mankind in order to appease the China lobby. Now you must act as though you mean it. You have told the people that American power has no limits, for flattery of the people is quote unquote good politics. Now you must act as though you mean it. That sounds like any contemporary theorist of rhetorical coercion or rhetorical entrapment, to use Jim Fenning's phrase. It is in fact from In Defense of the National Interest by Hans Montag. Rhetoric, then, as an understanding of political problematic, and we want to argue as a resolution, or at least a potential way to move towards addressing that problematic, is not the opposite of realism. It is, in fact, right at the center of realism, both explanatory, evaluatively, and as part of its political project. And how that political project played out is what I will now leave to my very eloquent colleague to describe.
Thank you. I'll start with a warning for anyone who might consider doing something with Mike that you might end up in a situation like this. It's not just about writing, it's about presenting as well. Had not thought about that before I said yes, but I'll do my best to pick up where Mike left off. In a sense, there's a longer history behind this paper than the project on rhetoric and realism that we're currently engaged in. There's a longer history, goes back I think almost 8 years from here, to a joint paper we did on that was interested in viewing rhetoric as the lens through which you could approach realism as a negotiation of ideas between Europe and the US. And in a way, I suppose, where the rest of what I have to say comes in is in that move from Europe to the US. Because the kind of analysis that Mike landed on, an analysis of what is wrong with American liberal grand strategy, is an analysis inspired by his European, or the realists in general, European trajectories and inspirations. And it's an analysis that kind of tries to find a middle road in between a European tradition that has always been more aware of the need for rhetoric and for mobilization and the dimension of affect in politics, but has taken that to an extreme and manipulative position. And then an analysis of an American tradition, or at least a strand in an American tradition, that has no keen eye for that affective dimension, for that need for mobilization and for connecting grand strategy to larger visions about the we behind those strategies. And that then has to resort in a way to copies of the European model. It has to resort to nationalist, extreme languages, universalist metaphors, etc., to mobilize in situations where the public does need to be mobilized. So what I want to try and say is that in the US, Morgenthau, and with him, figures like Renan Niebuhr, and in our paper, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. is also another central figure, tried to formulate, we believe, a sort of a middle road, or at least an alternative, and very much a US-inspired solution. So think of the Second World War, the emergence of a number of European immigrants in the US in sort of the inter and immediate post-war period, defined. And the paper, in a sense, tries to posit that moment as the framework within which one should engage with the realist attempt at a solution. And I think we've also been more keenly aware that there is a very extensive realist engagement with thinkers we'd normally posit as liberal thinkers, thinkers like Walter Lippmann, John Dewey, that this was a moment in the US obsessed with the role of the public sphere, obsessed with the role of public opinion, which in a way is another approach to the question of rhetoric and mass politics, but one that did not and insisted. I know that someone like Lippmann ended up in total despair, but there was an attitude in the US connection or context that somehow tried to come to grips with, was it not possible to view the public as something else than a mere object of manipulation? Wasn't it possible to somehow do something with that public that could make it a constructive force in trying to inhibit some of those extreme and potentially destructive forms of rhetoric that Europe had landed itself in? And I think if as Mike said, there's perhaps, to those who think that realism can never be associated with liberal thought and etc., something outrageous about that claim. And if you want to go to sources of support, I think the three main documents that our analysis rests upon is Morgenthau's The Purpose of American Politics, Niebuhr's The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, whose subtitle is something like A Vindication of Democracy and a Critique of its Traditional Defenders, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s The Vital Center, which has a very parallel analysis to the two other books. And what those three works, if we have to boil it down to these three sources, what they contain is an approach to how you may think of foreign policy, think of grand strategy as directly connected with the constitution of a political being that can will and can strategize, but that doesn't land you in sort of European nationalism, extreme languages of demagogy and so on. And it has three components. First of all, it has an insistence that you need a rhetoric of transcendent foundings that somehow have built into them, sacred foundings, but that somehow have built into them something that will help restrain the we just constituted, something that will help that we constantly correct itself or retain itself. It also has built into it a notion that you have to embed this sort of rhetoric in a political order, in a type of political mechanism that has competition, contestation, agonism at its heart, because those mechanisms are ultimately what will help self-restraint take place. Okay. And finally, and this is very central, this is extremely central actually, there is an insistence that for this strategy to be successful, you have to understand political leadership differently than democratic theory has normally done. Because democratic theory tends to think of political leadership as something that necessarily leads you in the direction of more authoritarian, elitist, aristocratic forms of politics. But these thinkers insist that the politician who understands that political leadership is about formulating visions that connected to those transcendent foundings is actually what initiates and drives the dialogue, that what sort of fuels that democratic contestation. So it's a source of vitality, and there's a central quote by Morgenthau somewhere where he says that one needs to understand that to sort of revive political leadership is not just to enhance the president's capacity for governing the people. It is equally a reopening of a dialogue that will enhance the people's capacity for governing the president. targeted at this dialogue between the US, or between Europe and the US, where it's called heroic leadership, that tries to say that Europe lands in charismatic forms of leadership. He engages Weber there and much of what Mike talked about. But the US ought to return to its historical roots, return to the Republican tradition of its founders and their understanding of what rhetoric was about, and understand that leadership can have this democratizing function, and connected to Mike's quote about rhetorical entrapment, until democratic theory in the US and liberal democracies of the 20th century understand that you need this type of leadership, that it can be a source of pluralization, vitalism, democratic contestation. Until they do that, they will constantly have to resort to forms of secessionism and politics. It'll land you in much more dangerous, much more charismatic forms of politics eventually. So that's I wish I could have said much more about this, but that is sort of the three components that they think they find in an older American political tradition, tied to this notion of making the collective, the people, the source, the sacred source that you rhetorically mobilize to institute them, rather than a single idea of a single national purpose or a single national mission. There's something pluralizing, they believe, about that mission. Okay, I wish I could have said more about that, but I want to land us on some conclusions that has perhaps a little broader relevance to this conference as such. Because I think there are many elements of this paper that I suppose touches on things that Mike has written about in the past, and elements of what others have written about in the past, but what I think we really want to bring out here is what a perspective on rhetoric, on political narrative, can bring to the understanding of realism. And first of all, obviously, this is the lens through which you really recognize the poverty of much of contemporary realist thought. It's the lens that really shows that grand strategy has become very sort of schematic, mechanistic analysis of power, geopolitical power relations, and ends, means, modes of thought. This is simply the lens that shows that the realists never thought about these issues without connecting them to almost everything we've talked about here, like fundamental questions about what drives human beings in politics, what is the nature of political order, what is the nature of political community. So as such, it just brings out that grand perspective that realism is about. It also, if one really engages with it, helps to move realism away from sort of the traditional critique as a conservative, and a sort of autocratic, elitist mode of thought, and towards liberalism. And I think perhaps the most important point, and it says a lot, I would say, and Mike would agree that it says quite a lot about American politics today. Martin Luther's quote probably could have been used on sort of the Bush administration, on much of what has gone on in the conservative connection, the Tea Party movement, etc. Could also be applied to the European Union and its sort of lack of ability to formulate a grand vision behind its grand strategies, and the resort to various forms of nationalist rhetoric that leaves European countries left with. But fundamentally, perhaps the most important